Good morning, Professor Matthew.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm
Good evening
fine,
to you.
thank you.
Good
Yeah, thank you. It's 8 p.m. here, almost.
Yeah, so kind of late for a talk, but early for
Not
a
too
talk
late,
here.
sir. Not too late.
Matt, I'm guessing this is the earliest you've ever done a talk.
I'm trying to think. I did give a talk to for a group in India, but that I don't. For some reason, it might have been an hour later or something. But yeah.
I hope it's not too early for you, sir.
No, I've got my coffee.
Okay, that's great. Okay, before we get started, let me introduce myself again. My name is Thanyalak Chansombat. I am from Naresuan University. I am a geography lecturer at Naresuan University, Thailand. Let me say good morning, Professor Ian and Professor Matthew in America, and good evening. Good evening, everyone in Thailand. Here we have 28 people here in live in our Zoom. And welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today webinar. Today we are presenting our third webinar, the Virtual Geography Speaker Series 2020 to 2021, hosted by University of Wisconsin Madison, Chulalongkorn University, Chiang Mai University, Naresuan University, and Geographical Association of Thailand. And I'd like to say just a little housekeeping before we get started. If any one of you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box in your Zoom, and we will bring them up during the presentation. Or if you have question, you can ask the question at the end of the presentation as well. And now let me turn the time over to Professor Ian today. Professor Ian Baird is the geography professor at University of Wisconsin Madison, United States of America, and he is the director of the Center of Southeast Asian Studies and the coordinator of the Hmong Studies Consortium at University of Wisconsin Madison as well. And let me give this Zoom webinar to our Professor Ian. Please welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Matthew Turner, who is a professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he's one of my colleagues. We're in the same department. And we both do work on political ecology, although in very different parts of the world, but on some similar topics and sometimes some difference as well. Professor Turner is a Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor in Geography, which means he is well regarded as a geography professor at our university. He has actually been a faculty member in our department since 1995, after he completed his PhD at University of California, Berkeley, a few years before that. He works on his primary sort of intellectual area of interest is political ecology, although he also has an interest in science and technology studies. And in particular, his work is largely focused in West Africa, in a number of countries in West Africa. And he has done a lot of work on pastoralism. So how people raise livestock in the arid lands of parts of West Africa. And he's published a large number of articles in most of the top journals in geography. I won't go into his list of publications, it's much too long for this introduction, but he's done some important work within geography and especially in relation to political ecology. If I was to point to a couple of articles that people might like to look at in terms of his work in the future, I would suggest articles that he wrote a series of a three-part series of articles in Progress in Human Geography regarding the present state of the subfield of political ecology within geography, which I think would be the pieces that I would recommend for those who are not familiar with his work. So I won't take too much time in introducing Professor Turner. I'm eager to listen to his talk. We rarely have a chance to listen to each other, speak when we're even though we're in the same department. So this will be interesting for all of us. And I think has Professor Turner been made a co-host so he can share his screen?
I see the button, so I should be able to share my screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, then, without further ado, please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Ian, and thank you for the generous introduction. And I'd like to thank the organizing committee. I know it's multiple institutions, but certainly Thailand's Geography Association for inviting me to this lecture series. It's a real joy to kind of share my ideas with you all. And rest assured, I mean, I'm going to be using some examples from West Africa, but the ideas that I'll be talking about, I hope will be very much relevant to you all in Thailand. Before I start sharing my screen, I just want to also say that just to make sure that people kind of understand what I'm saying, I'm going to have more text on my slides than I normally do, so that I'll be both talking and then you can also be reading while I go through the lecture. Okay, so let me share my screen. Can people see that?
Looks good.
Okay. So what I'd like to talk about today is the issue of the inference of causality, with a focus on environment and development questions. But I think the issue of coming up of developing understandings of cause in relationship to processes, both biophysical and social, these are issues that exist in a wide range of intellectual pursuits. And my basic argument is that we are in a situation where we have an explosion of data, particularly quantitative data, but at the same time, we have failures of explanation. So that as I'll develop, we have increased availability, largely kind of global kind of databases around a wide range of topics, but in terms of looking at the relationship, the causal relationship between various what we could call variables, that our capacity has not kept up with this data explosion. And so I'm going to be talking about that, and it's going to be fairly abstract. I mean, hopefully understandable, but abstract kind of exploration of this dilemma in the section Roman numeral number 1. And then I'll turn to a short but important section where I talk about kind of the promise of geography to address these issues that we see today. And I'm going to be relying heavily, and many of you probably have not heard of this book, but Andrew Sayers' book on method in social science, one of the most important books in terms of dealing with the philosophy and method of causal inference. And so I'll briefly talk about that, and then I'll turn to giving you an example of the power of mixed methods for explaining a particular phenomena, in this case, trans-Saharan migration from West Africa towards to North Africa and towards Europe. I'm sure many of you have heard of the loss of life in the Mediterranean. I'm going to be looking at the underlying causes for West African migrants to cross the Sahara to reach Europe, and the underlying look at kind of the various simple kind of narratives that explain this, and present some work that is under review that gives a much more complex explanation for this phenomena. Whoopsie. Okay. So first, some initial observations. The first is that when it comes down to it, in most of our research, we seek to identify causal connections between phenomena or among phenomena to build a better understanding of the world, and particularly for more applied work to guide policy, right? To actually understand the world, we need to kind of understand causal relations. And also to build effective policy, we need to understand how one change can lead to other changes, okay? And this is at a very basic level. In much of the world, and certainly in the field of geography, we are working in situations where conditions cannot be controlled through experimentation, right? So causal inference is very difficult, and it is prone to kind of observer bias. So it's very important to kind of understand and take seriously the difficulties in research to identify cause, especially in complex situations, uncontrolled situations, where we have an unfolding of events over time with often multiple causes affecting the phenomena of concern. Over the past 15, 20 years, the availability of information about the phenomena that we study has expanded greatly. Okay, 30 years, sorry. But it's not this explosion of information is generally not reflected in significant growth in our understanding of causal, and this is important, causal relations among social and environmental processes. So an open question is, has this failure to tease out causes among this expanding mass of information and data, is this a reflection of the world just becoming more complex, or are we, and we is in a very broad sense. I'm not talking about geographers per se. I'm talking about basically the global community. Are we failing in the task of causal inference? So I'm gonna raise these observations, and then I'm gonna kind of come back to this explosion of information and data. So I'm not going to give you statistics, but I'm just going to basically say, I'm sure that you all that there has been an increased availability of data, expansion among other things, of remote sensing, social media platforms, etc. And this explosion of information from these to an increased competition to produce more quantitative measures that can circulate, that are decontextualized from the places that they are obtained. And these range from soil information systems to biodiversity to indices of violent conflict, corruption, poverty, climate vulnerability, etc. I'm sure you're all familiar. These are often global databases, and they have worked along with the technologies that are driving the initiation of what I would call, in very loose terms, big data, to kind of this data explosion. Now, it's important to understand the different modes of analyses, how this data, often quantitative data, indices or what have you, have been used. I would say often qualitative methods are described as being descriptive, but I would actually say that the bulk of the quantitative analyses that have been done with these types of data are what I would call quantitative descriptions. In the end, they aren't really getting into causal relations between phenomena, right? So it's using quantitative data to describe spatiotemporal patterns with little attention to causation. In another use of these data are what I would call acausal prediction, and this is the use of machine learning to predict based on just patterns in the data without gaining an understanding of causal relations. And then finally, the area that I'm going to be focusing on is causal analyses. And these causal analyses despite the variables, rely on spatial or temporal correlation to infer causal relations. And so, again, this is the next couple slides. I'll be talking about this portion of the use of this expanded availability of data. So, as I mentioned just now, no matter their analytical sophistication, quantitative analysis in non-controlled situations rely, at least in part, on spatial temporal correlation to infer causation. So let me give you some examples. The first example is less problematic, but far from earth-shattering, right? Rates of deforestation are greater closer to roads or population centers. In other words, people cause deforestation. Mentioned, this is far from revelatory, right? So this is a very kind of very narrow solution cause. More problematic inference, but of greater potential interest to policymakers, to scholars, is in the realm of, my example comes from in the realm of climate change research, which Sub-Saharan Africa, a kind of major climate parameters, right? There are articles on conflict in areas being associated with periods of high heat, for example. Okay. So the differences in these two cases is both the implicit length of the causal chain and the potential for intervening factors. You could imagine that in that second example of heat causing violence, there are a lot of other potential intervening provide direct conflict, economy, right? Second, another major factor is the degree to which the phenomena in which we're looking are directly observable. So if we understand, and this is not new to us as geographers, that for most all kind of phenomena of that we're interested in study, there are webs of causation, right? Of interacting factors or processes that lead to the observed phenomena. And common problems in kind of causal analysis that often reduces this causal web to several variables and looking for their relationship, their correlation, include spurious correlation, which is the false inferences of causal relationships between two variables based simply on their correlation in time or space. I'm sure all of you have heard the mantra, correlation does not equal causation. We also have issues of shifting of socio-ecological organizational scales. So, which is often, sometimes we refer to this as the ecological fallacy, that relationships observed for groups of things are seen as necessarily holding for individuals. And that is a fallacy, right? Various kind of attributes will vary based on the relative grouping in social and ecological organization. And the another oh, go ahead. Sorry. Should I continue?
Continue, Matt.
Okay, I just is scaling parsimony, where there's a tendency for people, like if there's phenomena at a kind of a very broad scale, then this must be large regional factors rather than the aggregate outcomes of local processes. Okay, so this is an issue of scale, right, in the analyses, and the attribution of cause associated with kind of assumptions of causal powers at particular scales based on observations. Now, the analysts that are using, seeking to find causal relationships through correlations are aware of these issues, right? It's not that they're ignorant of these issues, and therefore they tend, at least based on my experience, to test causal connections that seem reasonings and narratives, right? So that if they were to find kind of an unusual kind of causal connection through that would lead to kind of invoking, well, this must be a spurious correlation. So there's a tendency built that seem to be reasonable or are widely kind of seen as plausible, right? Okay, so that this is what I refer to as confirmation bias. There's a tendency to do analyses, these types of analyses, to confirm already existing kind of understandings out there. And this is where from a political ecology perspective, this is troubling, right? Because the general kind of understandings out there, particularly in areas that are fairly data sparse or information sparse, are what we would refer to and is referred to in the literature as an environment and development narratives. These are kind of widely circulating kind of causal sequences or narrative stories used to explain social environmental phenomena within not necessarily the scholarly community, but the scholarly community is implicated within conservation and development communities. Various characteristics of these narratives. They're simple stories of explanation, stripped of local context, that allow for their broader circulation, right? Population, overpopulate, like a common kind of Malthusian narrative, the Malthusian narratives is overpopulation causes environmental degradation. A simple but powerful in its simplicity narrative. Another example would be the tragedy of the commons, right? Resources that are held in common are more likely to be overused or exploited. Another powerful, probably one of the most powerful environmental narratives that exists, but flawed in large part because of its simplicity and decontextualization from the realities on the ground. These narratives are often strongly shaped by institutional prerogatives. Institutional activities and expertise can shape diagnoses, right? So again, institutions will tend to kind of focus on particular narratives that support their existence, right? Their form of expertise. They are often crisis-driven. Crisis is used to motivate action. Periods of active promotion of particular narratives coincide with publicized problems. They persist in widely accepted common knowledges, particularly where expression of alternative understandings are muted due to power differences. While they are not solely generated by scientific research, these ideas are attractive to researchers because of their general nature, right? Again, as scientists, many of us are seeking to make general claims about the world. Oopsie. And in narrative or computational forms, they rely on spatial temporal juxtaposition of what's are seen as problems, right? From a development and conservation perspective. So I'm going to give you an example. That beautiful poster announcing my talk correctly identified the Sahel, which is actually Arabic for shore. And it's the southern fringe, the arid fringe where of the Sahara Desert. So it's literally seen as the shore of the Sahara Desert. It is arguably the poorest region in the world. Again, how we measure poverty is open to debate. So I'm going to say that's why I'm saying arguably. It's a dryland region with variable levels of low productivity. It is an area of recurrent crisis. And it is an area of low political economic power, both within civil society as well as by member nations within global systems of power. So it historically has been a fertile ground for externally circulated causal narratives, right? Narratives produced by outsiders to explain the problem, the environment and development problem of the Sahel and its peoples. Some examples of these narratives, the idea of desertification, anthropogenic desertification. It's the ignorance of local people, or the fact that there are underdeveloped property institutions that cause the misuse and literally the marching of the desert. That has been now debunked. I already mentioned the tragedy of the commons, the idea of global markets and land degradation, population-induced land degradation. This region was a major example that led to the idea of sustainable development, right? That the alleviation of poverty can lead to environmental amelioration. And then two more recent narratives, which I'll talk a little bit about in the subsequent slides, is that climate change, this is an area that is very vulnerable to climate change, and it has experienced very early on downfall, drops in rainfall tied to climate change, is that climate change and violent conflict is fueled by resource scarcity or drought. The second would be what is referred to as climate refugees, right? Which is something that a case that I'll expand on later. Simple explanations for the movement of Sahelian people across the Sahara in search of work. So these are the two examples I'll talk about. The first is being that climate change leads to drought, leads to competition of resources, leads to violence, and particularly violence, organized violence led by jihadi movements. This is a widely circulating narrative. Clearly, for example, in my country's State Department, it's widely kind of assumed and held sacrosanct. Whoopsie. And so this narrative has led to quantitative analyses seeking to confirm or refute the narrative, but simply focused on a kind of a narrow set of variables. And so since 2010, there has been a rapid increase in quantitative studies looking at the spatial correlations of incidents of insurgency violence with deviations of local temperature or rainfall. The second example would be this idea of climate refugees. Thomas Friedman is always great for these types of these narratives. Global warming has already created tens of millions of climate refugees and could go on to drive as many as a billion people from their homes over the next 40 years. This is in an article in the New York Times referred to as titled "Out of Africa." And so the narrative here is climate change leads to drought, leads to trans-Saharan migration towards Europe. Again, labor migration is a long-standing kind of phenomena in many parts of the world, including West Africa. The fact that there's now this shift towards Europe, towards North Africa and Europe, has led to increased scrutiny. That tied with the realization of climate change and the recognition of climate change has led to a juxtaposition and an assignment of causation. So we have increased rapid increase in quantitative studies focused on the spatial correlation of measures of emigration, including seasonal migration to cities with deviations in local temperature and rainfall. Now, this is a figure that shows deviations in regional mean rainfall across the Sahelian region since 1900 to, in this case, 2017. And you can see that 1970, 1980 into the mid 1990s, there was a significant downturn in rainfall, right? So persistent drought. But since 1995, again, there has been a partial recovery in rainfall. And I show you the kind of the timing of jihadi insurgency and trans-Saharan migration, the upswings in these. And you can see it's during this period of partial rainfall recovery to that long-term mean. And in fact, other remote sensing analysts refer to the greening of the Sahel during this same period. So we can see that even just looking at the temporal pattern of rainfall, which figures prominently in these narratives of conflict and migration, we see that there's something a bit off here in terms of the timing of these events relative to drought. So I would offer this idea of literally a failure of causal inference sustains scholarly ignorance about the environmental social dynamics in the Sahel and other regions. And what I call this is an analytical echo chamber, where we have development and conservation offered narratives, right? These are kind of outsider, institutionally framed environmental development narratives about the problems that need to be fixed. And these lead to, because again, these type of analyses are prone to problems of spurious correlation, et cetera. So a confirmation bias of leading to kind of arm's length, armchair, literally in the chair, not in the field, not talking to local people, analyses of a simple set of variables to seek confirmation of these narratives by testing relationships among a narrow set of variables. And so this is my assessment, largely driven by my experience in sub-Saharan Africa, of this impasse between increased availability of data, but at the same time, kind of a stalling out, limited achievement of grappling with the more complex causal mechanisms behind the various phenomena that we're interested in around the world. And here I turn to the second part of the talk, where I would argue that the discipline of geography offers much to get beyond this impasse, okay? For a number of reasons. One, geography, we do not shirk from complexity, right? Geographers recognize that phenomena around the world are caused by multiple factors. We recognize historical contingency and nonlinear dynamics affecting the phenomena of concern. We also embrace place, and we recognize that there's a diversity of situations shaping phenomena around the world. We are, let's say, uncomfortable with blanket kind of statements of causality that some of these environmental and development narratives offer. We also embrace the importance of scale. Causal processes operate at different spatial and temporal scales and organizational scales. And then within the field of geography, we have developed significant expertise in a wide range of methods, spanning qualitative methods through quantitative methods. And within our discipline, and I'm not saying that these are easy conversations, but we have conversations about the relationship, right, and the synergies or disjuncts between, let's say, qualitative methods and quantitative methods. Now, one of the most important books in geography is the book written by Andrew Sayer called Method in Social Science. So this is a very brief summary of this book, and certainly for those of you that do mixed methods, or those of you that do quantitative methods, I would very much urge you to check out this book, right? And if for those of you that don't have access to it, I can send you PDFs of key chapters, because I've used this in some of my seminars. Okay. First thing, as a philosopher, Sayre recognizes that causal inference is very difficult, but he rejects kind of a relativist position that, okay, well, the cause is determined by the observer, right? So an extreme relativist position is causation is simply determined by the eyes of the beholder of the phenomena in question. He rejects that. He also argues that statistical analysis alone is insufficient to demonstrate causality, and he's not alone in making that argument, with stronger cases developed through the addition of qualitative information, right? Key qualitative information for appropriate inference are the causal, what he calls the causal powers and liabilities held in relationships among variables, or I think Paul Robbins spoke to you, what Paul Robbins would describe as objects. So this book is very much a call for mixed methods, right? Quantitative analyses can be used to explore regularities in the world, but in addition to those descriptions of regularities, there is a need for qualitative analysis to understand possible mechanisms of causation within and outside these regularities. So I'm going to give you an example of kind of a mixed method approach to looking at questions of causation. And this is the case that I've already mentioned, is understanding kind of trans-Saharan labor migration, in this case from a Sahelian country called Niger, right? And this is based on two manuscripts that are in review right now, that I list at the bottom of the slide. And we've already talked about like the upsurge of migration, and again, in the international press, we most likely hear about kind of the loss of life in the Mediterranean as people are trying to get to Italy or to Spain, etc. But again, a larger loss of life occurs in the desert, even prior to getting to the Mediterranean shores. And commonly invoked drivers is climate change, as we already talked about, the idea of climate refugees. And second is just a generic idea of like poverty. It's the poverty of the Sahelian region that are pushing people to embark on these dangerous voyages. And again, both of them have problems at the onset, right? I mean, yes, people are poor, right? But does that explain why some people go across the Sahara Desert and others don't? So we'll get into that as we move through the case. Whoopsie. So this is a map of the area that the study is based in, the Sai and Kolo districts in southwestern Niger. And these are the kind of the major routes. And it's not just people from Niger that use these routes. Those that are crossing the desert to get to Algeria or Libya onwards to the Mediterranean Sea, basically follow these routes, so that most of the West African migrants actually follow these routes, go through Niger to get on their right way to North Africa or Europe. In fact, well, I won't. Yeah, in fact, actually, the European Union has paid the country of Niger this to try to keep migrants in Niger and obstruct their movements further north. But I something that I can talk about, but I won't. I won't right now in this talk. Field research was conducted working with both families that have trans-Saharan migrants with as well as and also talking to return migrants within 10 communities in the Sai and Kolo districts of Niger. This involved 300 odd interviews of both non-migrant and migrant households, 66 interviews of return migrants about their motivations for leaving, 100 interviews with boys and men. Again, this migration stream is very gendered. It's dominated by young men. But boys and men who had not yet gone on trans-Saharan migration to assess their views about their futures and how that relates to labor migration. And then 21 interviews of return migrants about their experiences in the Sahara. So I'm not going to provide you a regression, various regression tables. I'm just going to give you an overview of the statistical findings of this study. So households with trans-Saharan migrants did not differ from others with respect to food insecurity or exposure to drought and flooding. The only difference that was found between households with trans-Saharan migrants and those without was that households with trans-Saharan migrants were statistically larger than other households, right? So that households that had migrants tend to be larger, and suggests that there is some thinking on the part of migrants about the labor requirements of the family in their the labor needs of the family, and whether there was sufficient labor on the in these are rural areas on the farm, so to speak, to cover the absence of the migrant. The timing of the rapid increase in this area of trans-Saharan migration, the rapid increase occurred and has increased, and it has been sustained since, started in 2013 through 2015, does not coincide with political events, exchange rates between source countries and destination countries, or rainfall changes. Some findings from qualitative interviews. Families have lost contact with, in many cases, a presumption that these migrants have died, with approximately 10% of trans-Saharan migrants. The migrants and non-migrants are well aware of the high risks of trans-Saharan migration, so they are not entering into this endeavor in ignorance. Despite this, families generally support the decisions of young men to leave for the Sahara. Most migrants that leave for the Sahara have prior labor migration experience to sub-Saharan African countries. And experiences en route and at destinations, to say the least, are very difficult. And I'm going to give you some short quotes from the narratives, the travel narratives that we collected two quotes concerning the kind of the crossing the Sahara, and then one quote concerning their work conditions in Libya. Okay, and these quotes are all associated with destinations towards Libya. So the migrant says, as soon as you enter the vehicle, you will see things you have never seen in your life. In a vehicle with the capacity of 40 people, the transporter puts more than 100 people. You are placed on top of each other so that everyone suffocates. Then there are thieves among you who take every opportunity to take what you have on you. There are problems of water, food, the climate that is very hot, Sahara, as well as diseases. In fact, migrants would describe how their placement in these trucks are very similar to historical documents that talk about the placement of slaves on slave ships back in the 1700s and 1800s in the transatlantic slave trade. So this migrant says, yes, it is far. We spent 4 days in the desert. 4 days. Along our journey, we would see dead people lying on the ground, people who died during the crossing. From time to time, the cars would stop and park at night, leaving 1 or 2 dead people before leaving at dawn. One could ask why not wait to bury somebody, but no, people continue their journey, leaving the bodies to scavengers. So we continue, those are animal scavengers. So we continue our journey, and it was early in the morning that we reached Jeannette. And then here's an excerpt from a transcript about an interview about work conditions in Libya. And so he's referring, when he says they, he's referring to bosses, Libyan bosses who hire them for kind of temporary work. Most often they deceive us. They take us to remote places so much that you have a hard time being able to come home on your own. They take us to gardens to work on the basis of what is agreed between us. Once we arrive there, they refuse to accept what has been agreed to, and we are obliged to accept what they offer us. Otherwise, they will not take us home, and we are afraid of being shot on the road. Sometimes in searching for work, we are captured and tortured by armed groups. They plug electrical power to make us cry out to our families by phone and blackmail them so that our families have to pay for them to free us. Okay, so this is a situation, a work situation, that they're entering into Libya, a country that remains, and certainly during the time period of this interview, of variously ruled by competing armed groups. So this is a situation of high violence and precarity in terms of economic precarity and precarity of life. So I just provided those short kind of examples of the description of these voyages to point to the serious nature, right? People are not entering into these voyages in ignorance. They know what's happening. And so this, and the fact that we're not finding statistical relationships between levels of poverty or climate variables to explain migration, this points to kind of a more serious social crisis that leads to these dangerous decisions to migrate. So current material conditions alone are insufficient explanations, household wealth and climate parameters. And then in talking to both young men as well as return migrants, young men who had not embarked yet, there is a sense of profound sense of hopelessness. And that hopelessness is not low rainfall, at least low rainfall during the 70s and 80s, might be a small part of it, but it's very much due to the lack of remunerative work. Always, migrants would say, we are going north despite all the risks to be able to do work, right? And actually produce something. In the migrant destinations to the south, in other sub-Saharan countries, generally people are kind of street merchants, right? And always these trans-Saharan migrants would say, despite all the hardships, the fact that we were paid, yes, paid, but also paid to build things, to grow things, remunerative work that was producing something, figured prominently in their reasons to embark on these dangerous voyages, to truly be, in their minds, there's a kind of a masculinist kind of view, to be men, right? To not just suffer in silence, but to take charge of their lives. And the conditions that they're talking about are, in terms of agriculture, a problem of soil fertility exhaustion, land grabbing by local elites. This is an area that surrounds the capital city of Niamey, and so there has been significant claims of land by elites that have pulled agricultural land from local communities, biased global markets for agricultural commodities, and also frustration with local gerontocracies, or the elders in their, including their fathers, about kind of gaining access to land and making productive use of their lives. In addition, there is some community and household pressure, right? You've described that they are seen as not loving their families, and they're not true men if they don't go and take the chance and seek to cross the desert. So I just provide you that example to say that to kind of reinforce that published analyses that rely simply on spatial temporal correlation between phenomena to infer causation are likely to confirm dominant narratives. Certainly, if it's published, confirm dominant narratives abstracted from local realities. Geography as a discipline and geographical studies using mixed methods provides a powerful way through which causal inference can actually be more seriously addressed. The example from the Sahel demonstrates that social phenomena are shaped by life histories of experience rather than triggers of poverty and climate parameters. And it's only through combining qualitative, in this case, in the example case, combining the qualitative material with statistical analyses that the underlying causal web behind complex phenomena such as social conflict, or in this case, labor migration, can be revealed. So I'll stop here. Sorry, I don't know if I went over. I'll stop sharing my screen. Oh.
Thank you, Matt. So we have some time, I think, for some questions. If anybody would like to ask any, please put up your hand, or if you would rather write your question into the chat, that's also possible. Well, maybe to get us started, I'll ask a question.
Sure.
I'm wondering to what degree the cause of these people wanting to migrate has to do with increased desire for consumer goods. Because these people are on the outskirts of the capital city, as you mentioned, so they're probably seeing some people in the cities with some material wealth. and maybe over time they're wanting to desire that more. And, you know, so they're looking for ways to make money to, you know, buy things that they see other people have and they don't have. And if that might be one of the drivers or one of the things that's causing people to want to go through difficult conditions to get to a place.
Yeah. So the results are kind of mixed in that regard. That was something that definitely we were looking at. Those young men, generally those young men that are coming from, let's say what we would call kind of by local standards, middle income families are more likely to point to that. And that's about kind of a quarter of the return migrants quarter to a third of the return migrants that we talk to. They would talk about, so their tendency is to talk about, you know, like, we want to go to a developed nation, we want these things. They talk about bringing back, you know, TVs and, you know, et cetera, right? 2/3 to 3/4 are talking about really much more basic things, right? And they're talking about supporting their families. Some of them are actually newly married. Some of them are not yet married and seek to develop some wealth so that they can actually get married. And some of them are actually talking about supporting their family for their fathers, their family with respect to their kind of birth family, young men that hadn't been married. So basically, they're going and they're purchasing. They're basically using the money to purchase grain to feed their families. So it's mixed. Yeah.
Okay, I see we have a question here from our University of Wisconsin-Madison alumni.
Oh, hi.
I'm Jim. Yeah, please ask your question.
Okay, so I think I understand the use of mixed method, especially from the last example that you gave. But in case that quantitative has been used to analyze, to confirm narrative. So in this case, I think that I'm not sure if we can see narrative as a method or it's just giving background of the research. So the question is how we differentiate between using narrative as method and using narrative as giving information or giving background for the research.
I'm really glad that you asked this question because a number of people might have been confused, right? Narrative is used in different ways, right? So there's kind of a narrative method of both research as well as the exposition of research in narrative, right? I mean, stories, we live in stories, right? Mm-hmm. A good scientific paper has the narrative, right? And obviously historical work, there's historical narrative, right? So that is tied to kind of research, right? The narratives I were talking about, right? And it's just a term that is used out there, are very simple stories, right? Very simple stories that widely circulate. I'm sure there are examples in Thailand, right? Related to kind of, let's say, deforestation, right? Really simple kind of stories that both abstract from local context and the complexity of underlying causation, and are actually attractive because of their simplicity, because it can generate kind of support politically, right? So the narratives I was referring to earlier, right? I guess I did say travel narratives, right? Later, but earlier in the talk were these simple understandings, right, of causation, which from a scholarly and scientific point of view are kind of problematic, but are highly influential in the environment and development world today, right? So does that help explain?
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't referring to kind of narrative in its use in research.
Okay. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
We have another question from Pao Tai. Pao Tai, would you ask your question?
We would like to look at statistics as the point of because right now I have two things come up in my mind. So first, I think that statistics can provide some kind of basic understanding to any circumstance that happens in the world. But some people may say that statistics may like mislead or obscure the reality in the situation. So I think that it's quite difficult to manage this kind of, how to say, dichotomy between using statistics to provide basic understanding and mislead or make people understand in different ways. So how can we manage this kind of problem in the real situation, particularly in the case of migration and environmentally induced problems in our world right now? Thank you.
Yeah, and let me let me explain that I'm not arguing against the use of statistics here. I'm saying that it can be misused if you only use statistics and infer causation from, let's say, basically correlation, right? Without actually qualitative information about kind of the mechanisms and the nature of the relationship, right? Because statistics, you just have a correlation. There's likely a fair number of mediating variables, right, that you cannot measure. And so statistics is good for understanding regularities, right, in the world, right? And that's an important part of research, right? But it does not, you cannot use statistics alone to kind of assign causation, right? Or people do it, but it's very hazardous, right? You know, due to this issue of kind of spurious correlation and ecological fallacy, etc. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think I know that in geography, because we are embracing the diversity of different situations, and we tend to kind of embrace complex webs of causation in the competitive marketplace of journal publications, etc. And in this era of kind of global change, those local accounts can be disregarded. Oh, that's just a local problem. That's just a local situation. Great work, pat Matt on the head. That's just a local problem, right? And therefore, this is where statistics can be useful, right? If you have a grounding in a particular locality and understand the qualitative nature and powers of different objects or variables, to get a better sense of the mechanisms of causation, right? Statistics can provide you, allow you to broaden out in a more informed fashion than if you have that grounding, that qualitative understanding in a particular place, right? So that's another use, particularly with respect to migration, right? Because again, the migration studies is very much dominated by, let's say broad surveys and kind of regional scale type of analyses. And so to engage engage critically into that literature, you often need to have a bit more breadth, right? And so that's, I didn't get into some of the broad kind of statistics that I did associated with these papers, but used to use the qualitative interviewing of migrants and their families to make more sense of the patterns, those broader patterns that are talked about in the literature and shown in this kind of broad scale data, providing a different sense of those patterns through that qualitative work. Does that help?
Very much. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
okay. Yeah.
I mean, I think that just to sort of summarize here a little bit, I think the important thing that Professor Turner's point is making is that geography is in a very good position to make use of both quantitative and qualitative data, and that we need both. And we shouldn't be arguing for one or the other, but actually we should be trying to make use of them together, and that we're a discipline that is capable of doing that better than a lot of other disciplines who are either, totally committed to only quantitative or only totally committed to only qualitative. But the geography has the ability to deal with some of these complex issues through combining the two, and that we as geographers should see the importance of both as part of our work. Okay, Ajahn Liwa, you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Professor Matthew Turner. I really enjoy your talk, and I also done a mixed method research for over the past 20 years myself, and I think it's very powerful. But I have a question. You mentioned about the way you interview that you selected boys and men, who are migrants. So I just wondering, and it's gender selected, right? So
Yeah.
It's quite different from, from the Asia migrants. So I just wondering, what's the reason for female that they're not, they don't want to migrate, or is it cultural reasons, or what?
Yeah. And great question. And so it's definitely cultural. There's a sense that in despite the fact that there's a long history of women, once they are married, right, to migrate as merchants, right? So some of the biggest merchants in West Africa are women, right? Unmarried women traveling alone is seen, there's a sense of shame associated with that for the family. They feel like they're putting their daughters or their sisters in harm's way, right? And so there's a cultural aspect to it. There's also it's also driven by the type of work that is occurring in North Africa. There is a increase. What is again, and that's culturally shaped, right? That the work in North Africa is not seen as appropriate women's work, right? Okay, but there is there is a trend, not from this study area, but from another part of Niger, of young women now increasingly going on their own to North Africa. And they're generally going there and as prostitutes. So that is increasing over the past 5 or 10 years within a particular ethnic group from another part of the country, the Hausa ethnic group. So we definitely asked, and actually a fair number of our informants at the household level were women, right? But in terms of migrants and return migrants, they were all men.